Hello and welcome to Gwyl 2021 Literature Day. I'm Will Dawson. I work for Gŵyl Haf, a festival of all things in translation based in South Wales. I'm joined today by Menna Elfyn. Menna is the most widely read and widely translated Welsh language poet of her generation. She covers innumerable subjects, always with a keen eye and a lyrical generosity. Today, Menna is going to be reading some of her own poetry, and I'll leave it to her to introduce those. I'm also going to be asking her about the Welsh language, about the act of translating and being translated, and I'm sure we'll cover a few other subjects besides. Menna, thank you very much for being here.
Thank you. Croeso.
I'd like to start by pointing out, I suppose, that as an English speaker, as a monolingual English speaker, I, like the rest of or the bulk of your readership rather, have only read you in translation. What's your relationship with your translators like, maybe your English-speaking translators? What's the act of being translated like?
Well, of course, I wrote about 4 books in the Welsh language before I was translated, or even the thought of translation occurred, because I'm a Welsh language poet, as you rightly said. And back in the 80s, I suppose, because I was involved more and more in political things such as anti-apartheid, the peace movement, Cymdeithas yr Iaith, the Welsh Language Society, and I found myself reading my poetry sometimes to English-speaking audiences, and I had to sometimes, for example, I remember reading a C&D conference in Hackney, of all places, and I didn't have translations. I had to hastily write something, what it was about. And so it was a gradual thing. I never thought I'd become this, lead this double life, and now multiple lives at that. I always assumed I was a Welsh language poet, but my poetry, I also realised, was far more than the confines of bardic Welsh language poetry, obsessed with competitions and eisteddfodau. My poetry always took another kind of stream, another kind of route. And being a woman poet as well, I found myself at odds in a way with a kind of bardic tradition that was predominantly male, well, almost all male when I started out writing poetry, and that made me realise that I spoke to nations across the world. You know, my work was more akin to people like Denise Levertov, half Welsh, remember? You know, Emily Dickinson, no, not quite. I wasn't, I wish I could have been locked in my room at times, but I was always involved with, you know, and people like Adrian Rich, those kinds of poets inspired me, as well as other wonderful American poets. And I loved, you know, I fell in love with Robert Frost and William Stafford and all the rest of them. So although I'm a Welsh language poet, that is only one vein of what I'm about, really. And although I studied Welsh at the university, graduated in Welsh and taught Welsh at Lampeter University. By the time I went back to university after a 10-year period of being freelance and doing lots of plays, I ended up teaching English, creative writing. So I did that U-turn of starting out wanting the Welsh language to survive, not only survive but thrive and be bold, and ended up living this kind of bilingual lifestyle, which is still exciting, but at times, you know, troubling. And I'm aware then that translators came to me rather than me going to them. I became friends with people like Robert Menennick, Nigel Jenkins, one of my first translators, who died in 2014. Elena Power, Gillian Clark and I have travelled the length and breadth of Wales and England in festivals, working together, and she was translating me, I was translating her. So it became also a kind of collective effort between languages.
Yeah, it's really interesting that you describe it as a double life, or as a kind of multilingual life, because there's a lot in your poetry about language being an act. I think you write in Marnad for Languages, you write that the true word for language is a tongue. You know, it's a muscle, it's an act. And in the case of at one time, threatened indigenous language like Welsh, it's a radical act. It links to your activism.
Oh, absolutely. It was in the same way endangered as we are looking at the planet today as being endangered. And one wanted to still believe that I could be a Welsh language writer, regardless whether I'd have you know, a huge audience or 12 people in a room. It was important to me because I believed then, as I believe now, if writers aren't at the very, you know, cutting edge of believing in the future of the language, what hope is there for anybody who's going to, you know, a Welsh medium school, possibly coming from an English language family, and that is something that is still my principle of saying, and when I do travel, I always say I am a Welsh language poet, but I am fortunate I have a host of translators who are invisible to you, but they are very much part of what I'm about, and have enriched my poetry, as I hope a few of them say I've enriched theirs, or, you know, they've grabbed a few of my ideas, and that's fine too.
Yeah, I when reading your poetry, I get the sense that maybe you're writing first for a Welsh-speaking audience, but certainly not only for a Welsh-speaking audience. And you have a whole host of international themes as well. You do look sort of beyond the local a lot.
That's true, and I think I've travelled in the last 20 years to so many countries. The British Council invited me to so many places, really, where there were differences in language. I remember going to Macedonia, for example, and being torn between people in Macedonia in the group, in workshops, who were annoyed that the Albanians hadn't, you know, hadn't learned their language, and the Albanians felt threatened because Macedonia was the main language, and all those kinds of difficulty, tensions, I could address and understand, and find a way through. And I think we ended up with a workshop making them write proverbs in their own individual languages and then getting them to translate one another. So translation can also be a way of breaking down barriers and believing that there is kind of harmony even through disharmony, that the words really is universal.
And that's so evident actually when you pick up one of your books, at least in the bilingual Welsh English edition, because on the kind of inside left hand page is the original Welsh, and on the right hand page is the translated English. You know, the poems are side by side, they're placed that you can't help but notice one another when reading them, no matter which language you're reading them in.
I wanted that to happen, and I think my first bilingual book was by Gomer, Eucalyptus, and I really begged them to bring that book out so that I have a book to take to readings of English language audiences. And there was a great resistance to my bringing out a parallel text in Welsh and English at that time. Gomer did bring it out, but then when Bloodaxe, and I'm thrilled that I'm one of Bloodaxe poets, and Neil Astley, in fact, had told me I looked everywhere for this Eucalyptus book and I couldn't find it. Will you? And then he asked me to go to him for my next book. And that was because Eucalyptus, with a press like Gomer, was stuck in Welsh shops rather than to the people I wanted it to go to, which is, you know, the 80% of people in Wales who don't speak Welsh, but they deserve to see Welsh. They deserve to feel that they can own Welsh. But there was resistance. I remember one reviewer saying, oh, I have to put a white page over the English. I just want to read her in Welsh. And then others say, well, her Welsh is so dense, it's so rich that you have to read the English sometimes to understand the Welsh, even though you speak Welsh. And I think that's very, I love that quote.
Yeah.
I love that idea that my Welsh is richer than just, you know, ordinary Welsh.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a kind of a language of language almost, isn't it?
Yes, it is. And in order to write in Welsh today, I believe to write well, you have to dig deep into the Welsh of the past. So I'm aware when I'm writing in Welsh that I sometimes slip in a very old Welsh word that nobody's used on tongue since the 16th century or 15th century. And that's exciting too, to think that you can reintroduce the language sort of in a subtle way. It's a bit like the lost words of, you know, Macfarlane and yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And you've been translated, at least into English. You mentioned Gillian Clarke and Robert Minanek earlier. They've been translating your work for the best part of 30 years or so. How has that relationship changed, or has it changed? You know, I think when we think about translating and translating poetry in particular, I've often heard translators stress a very close relationship with the author or with the poet, but I think it's fairly rare that someone is translated by the same person for such a long time. On top of that, you are bilingual and you can read the translation in the English. How does that influence the relationship with the translator?
I suppose it does for people like Robert and Gillian Clarke. I sometimes give them, you know, just a verbatim, although they usually don't need it. And a wonderful poet who was from Brooklyn, Joseph Clancy, who translated a lot of classical Welsh stuff. He used to hate the idea of me giving him that. He wanted to go after every single word and dissect it for himself. But there is a relationship, there is a friendship. I'm aware of their different styles. So there is a poem, for example, that I would give to Gillian, but I wouldn't give to Robert, and Robert, and likewise. Although if I'm desperate, I'll send to either. But I have discovered a very new translator who's a former writer on my course, actually. And I did we did a course in translation, and she somehow, Emma Baines is her name, a very unassuming poet, but she tends to do what I wanted to do, which is be bold and put something of yourself, or take the poem away, take it into your own space, as well as keep a bit of the transparency that it started with me. So I'm discovering new poets all the time who are able to translate. One translator, and I feel sad about this, and I'm reading her work on Saturday, Elena Powell, who not only was is a Welsh language poet, and her English is wonderful, and she speaks Irish, but she has dementia. And so I brought out, I collected all her poems and put them in a collection, and Bardas have published it. And I will miss her, because we were both brought up in the manse. We were both ministers' daughters. So there's a kind of language we owned that nobody else did as ministers' daughters. And yes, she's translated me for the past 40 years, but unfortunately can't anymore. But so I have to find new people. Yes.
Yeah. maybe let's actually listen to a poem. Perhaps let's listen to Misting. You can read that now, and then we can kind of continue the discussion afterwards.
Okay. Misting came out. Shall I give an introduction?
Absolutely, yeah.
The Misting came about because I was commissioned in 2016 to write a book between myself and a very well-known novelist, poet in San Sebastian in Donostia, who writes in Basque. And we were writing letters to one another about our work and about our backgrounds and our languages. And she wrote, Arancha Urita Bakaya is her name, and she wrote, her first letter to me said, you know, I know nothing of Wales. You mentioned fields, air, rain. This is all I know about Wales. And then she mentioned her looking out and loving the storm. And they have a word in Basque for it, which is land bro. And land bro means up, and bro means locality. And so, you know, there are even Basques, we don't know the history of the Basque language, but even that language has a kind of connection with Welsh, which I thought was fascinating. And so I thought of Misting, and I wrote this poem to her originally. Ni ddeallwn y dafnau brith all daflu niwl dros ein llyged, oedd hongian yn yr awyr, a'n rhwydo drwy ffawd at ffydd. We don't understand the speckling of drops that cloud our eyes, the misting in the air that confuses fate with faith. A single droplet seems enough of a distraction, like a fairground, arcades, dark glass, enticing us elsewhere. All I know of Wales, you say, but is this our history? Why must we be people of the mist, feeling ourselves dissolving? Ages ago we came here, and yet we are still confused by the mysteries of who we never were and what we'll never be. But this is where we yearn for our own acre of creation, the stone where we stand pre-Cambrian. Today we're collecting the flock, even the ones that wish to wander lost. There are no secrets for them in the world's weather. Fields, air, rain, as you say, and our long hide and seek in the mountains. But sometimes our eyes will rise for a sudden incandescence.
Brilliant, thank you. It's I love that poem. I'd like to ask you about the stylistic changes that result in translation, and Misting's a really good example of this, because maybe people who don't own the book might not know, but the Welsh is in quatrains, 4-line stanzas. The English is in couplets, in 2-line stanzas. You know, who between you and the translator makes a decision like that, not just here, but in the rest of your poetry? At what stage is that decision made in the kind of translation arc?
Well, that's how it was delivered to me by Robert. And I thought at the beginning, oh, this doesn't look like my poem at all, Niwlo. And then as I read it, I could see how he had interpreted it as couplets rather than my quatrains. And so I let it be. And I think if you're going to ask people to translate, if it's a good translation, why mess around with it? Why interrogate things you don't need to? Why be picky when there are other things to worry about? And if it sounds good, and if it captures the essence, all you could get in the translation is the essence of, I think, what Benjamin talks about, the reverberations from the forest, you know, sort of, or the transparency, if you could still think it was Welsh once, a bit, then that's good enough for me. Yes, so I don't interfere too much with translators, although when it comes to putting them in books for the final edit, I will have a closer look. And once or twice I have changed things. And people like Robert and or Tony Conran, I used to have wonderful, marvelous letters from Tony Conran. We'd have arguments at the beginning of my translation world. And in the end, he would say, "Tell me where to get off." And Robert likewise said, "Well, it's your poem, you know." And I always acknowledge them, and that's good enough for them, and it's more than good enough for me.
I was going to say, you know, they point out that it's your poem, but actually you seem very open to it being a project of collaboration. You seem open to actually it being their poem or our poem as such.
Yes. I don't want to lose them, for one thing, but also I want to acknowledge and recognize that translation is an art. It's an art form, and this is where Welsh has had to move and is moving slowly towards recognizing that English is the dominant language, and so many have been resisting getting their poems in translation as if they're scared of losing something. But it's what you also what you find, and there are riches to be found in translation. And so I don't have much sympathy with the idea that, as some would say, or if they want to read Welsh poetry, they'll have to learn Welsh. Well, no, poetry deserves, there's a nation's poetry, but there's world poetry. And we by now belong to world poetry. And I want people in the Philippines to read me just as much as I want people in Pontypridd, you know, perhaps there are more there. Because when I was in the Philippines, they loved the fact, you know, that that I wrote that I spoke English as if I was a writer of English, writer in English, and my whole education has been in English, and yet I wrote in this minority language, and I think I've given a lot of comfort to countries where there are poets who, Zimbabwe is another country where people say, "Oh, I could do this in Shona. I can bring out a book in Shona and English." You know, one doesn't have to negate the other, but they can be side by side as partners and equal partners.
And I think it's important, and you sort of have picked up on something there that I wanted to talk about, that Welsh is a minority language in the world, and you've written about the Akar language from the Andaman Islands, and there was a person called Boa Senior, I believe, who passed in 2010. And was the last fluent speaker of Akar, and they were the Andaman Islands were also colonized by the English, and within about 150 years, a language had been wiped out. You're in standing up for Welsh writing and standing up for Welsh language, you're also actually kind of flying the flag for other minority languages as well. You make the case for one, you make the case for all.
Yes, absolutely. And even in America, when I read there, and if I'm reading to, you know, African Americans, they also identify when I read some poem perhaps that talks about that minority status or feeling, you know, a second-class citizen, which we don't anymore in Wales, thankfully. But there was a time when one couldn't, you know, have Welsh education and Welsh forms and so forth.
And you've mentioned your activism earlier in the programme, and it's actually something that I'm quite interested to see how you feel your activism has changed, because you know, you went on marches, you prevented your work from being published or performed in apartheid South Africa. You know, you've had a sort of long anti-racist, anti-fascist kind of activist angle to your life and to your work. Was there an element of writing in Welsh that felt like activism that no longer feels like activism? Has that feeling changed at all?
That's a really good question, because I wrote a literary memoir in Welsh about 4 years ago, 3 years ago, uh, and it kind of looks at the past, you know, becoming uh, language activist, becoming a peace activist, becoming a feminist at a time when feminism wasn't the thing to do in the early 70s. Um, but all those things really, I think, were a way of expressing something and trying to be vocal and um, voice those who are voiceless in a way. And that hasn't changed, but I suppose I don't go out and, as I did in Brody, cut the fence of the American base back in the 80s, or go to prison anymore, but I still feel that sense of activism. I'm president of Wales PEN Cymru, and next week we will be celebrating Ilan Sami Cormac, who's been in prison for 27 years, and it'll be the first time he's had his birthday celebrated by a host of poets such as myself and Alice Oswald and lots of other international poets. And so the activism is still there, but I haven't felt the need as much to do more than work for Wales PEN Cymru, which takes up a lot of time. And of course, I've been writing the Western Mail for the last 25 years, every fortnight. And my column for tomorrow is mentions Yemen and you know, the madness of us selling arms to Saudi Arabia and not helping to try and stop the war there. So my principles haven't changed, but I suppose my way of acting out.
Yeah.
And I've always wanted to be a hermit. I've always wanted to be a solitary. So it suits me fine, this lockdown, but also not going to marches, not having to be that I don't know, that strong voice for various injustices, because there are so many, and you have to pick and choose what you can give your energy towards. And as it happens, pen is at the moment what drives me in the activist camp.
Absolutely. And moving on to sort of environmental activism and eco-poetry, maybe let's hear your poem, Welsh Ice.
I wrote Welsh Ice, well, way back a decade or more ago. And it started as a little joke because somebody said there's a piece of ice in Antarctica which melts every year, and it's the size of Wales. And of course, we know that very often there's a disaster. It's always the size of Wales. If there's famine, if there's an earthquake, it's the size of Wales. But I started to think about this ice, and then realized that there's something else going on here. And it's, of course, an environmental kind of poem. And Robert Menna Elfyn has translated it beautifully. But my first line in Welsh is Aur ar oen, and I was reading in Romania, and we were going over the Carpathians, and somebody said, "Oh, look, there's lambs snow," and a lamb snow is the last snow of the winter. So in Welsh, I've got Aur ar oen, Ia Cymru. I've put lamb, snow, Ia Cymru. They're twins. But Robert has done something beautiful in another way. Welsh Ice. They're becoming the same, Welsh ice and spring frost, both worn and afoot to a blue wafer. How alike as they leave us, how soon they'll be lost. Only bitterest breath comes over the glacier, where kisses are white wreaths upon a white coast. They're becoming the same, Welsh ice and spring frost. A kingdom must start or finish in floods. There's some iceberg with our epitaph written on its crown. How alike as they leave us, how deep they'll go down. We scarcely a cobweb, a rumour of ghosts, and a country might vanish at the turn of a key. They're becoming the same, Welsh ice, spring frosts. History thaws, but when has Mercury shown mercy or memory of what it murders? They're alike as they leave us, how soon they'll be gone. It starts at the pole in a kind of unlocking, and soon we're a legend beneath the blue level. They're becoming the same, Welsh ice and spring frost, so alike as they leave us, so soon to be lost. O'r pegwn pell, glasddwn yw'n hanes hir, wrth ymryddhau bydd llithro ach i'r llu, eir ar oen, ia Cymru wir. Datod nant I beichiau, gadael tir.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. That was, again, I love that poem. I'd like to move on and actually talk a little bit about well, a few things, but on the subject of hiraeth, actually. And in my research for this event, I listened to you speak to the poet Mab Jones about hiraeth, and there are a few things in that poem, and also Misting that we heard earlier, where you say, you know, who we never were and what we'll never be. There's this kind of rejection of a backwards looking hiraeth. Could you speak a little bit about how that has featured in your work, how that has maybe inspired, or how your rejection of it has inspired you?
Yes, I think I was being rather whimsical about hiraeth. It is a beautiful word, and I've used it in libretti and other places myself. And I have a great friend, Pamela Petro, was bringing out a whole book on hiraeth, so I better be careful what I say. But I do object to the very sentimental view of hiraeth, of a past that perhaps never was. We're talking valleys and the coal pits and so forth. We're talking about something that was, and yet hiraeth, I must admit, is a genuine, beautiful word, which its origin is also beautiful, because hir means long, and aeth, an old word for field. So it's a long field. And when you think about it, the old, you know, shepherds, or people who'd part, thinking of two lovers parting, you know, you'd long to see them come over that ridge or that, you know, hill, or before days of hedges. And so there is a kind of meaning, beautiful meaning to the word, but it's always stopped us from being assertive in a way, because we have been quite a timid nation, and all those years of being, you know, conquered has had its effect on us. And there's something nice about being timid in one sense. There's something nice about being the most timid of all the nations in the British Isles. You know, but there's a reason behind that as well, because they sent the English schoolmasters to our schools to teach us wonderful English. And of course, they sent soldiers to Ireland, and of course, the Scots had their own wars to fight. So hiraeth is a word that I'm skeptical about, as being a word that's bandied about as being something very nice. But of course, it does have its kind of root in mean something that you can't really retrieve, something that's there, and that feeling and it might be a feeling for a world that isn't anymore. And I think with the environment as it is, hiraeth is a very powerful word to describe that sense of you can't go back, but you long to go back. So it's kind of stronger than longing, nostalgia, and all the other words, you know, saudade, Portuguese, and all those other words. Yeah.
I think in your work, what I really your relationship to hiraeth seems to be that you're kind of taking this one aspect of it of sanctuary and of protection, and actually language and the Welsh language in particular being a kind of wall. And you even have a book called Murmur, which the Welsh translation is wall. Within that there's a poem called Murmurs, and I've taken down a quote here where you say that we murmur a language strange to others, and there's this kind of understanding that there's a kind of element of hiraeth that is, like you say, maybe it brings out the timidity, but actually it also, the language can kind of form a bedrock of identity, I suppose.
Yes, and a bedrock that hopefully is a living, you know, rather than something that is lost, which is when hiraeth is very often used in that respect. Although I don't want to be too negative about people when I read in places in, it could be in England, in some cities, and people say, oh, my grandmother spoke Welsh, and you know, and I only know hiraeth is one of those words they automatically know for some reason, along with pa siarad fan y pant. You know what that means? Don't speak in front of the children. So it's two parents who speak Welsh saying, don't say that in front of the children in a language the children don't understand. So, but no, perhaps I shouldn't be so, I shouldn't object so much to hiraeth. It is a nice language, and as I've said, I've used it in an opera actually, hiraeth, for a place, but also for people and for history. But we have to look forward.
Absolutely. And so looking forward for you, you have an exhibition of your work coming out in 2023 in London. Perhaps you could speak a little bit about that.
Well, there are two Chinese translators who are busily translating my work into Chinese and Mandarin, and they brought out a chapbook when I was in Hong Kong back in 2013. They wrote out the book, and then they contacted me about 6 months ago and said, "Are we still reading your work?" And I asked what they'd read, and they'd bought all my books, which is a bit alarming to think of people in China reading my books. And they said, "We want to make an exhibition because we're also architects, we're also artists, and we see a lot of motifs in your work to do with architecture, with Bondo, of course, means the eaves of a house, but there's a lot about doors. There's a lot about, you know, rooms, I suppose, and they sent me a fleet of images that had already created using my words or a title of a poem alongside their images. So yes, it's quite exciting, but a bit scary to think of an exhibition with my poetry. But that's what happens with poetry and with all art forms, is that people identify and take it to somewhere else and to recreate. There's no stopping the creation of art that will come from a single word or a single poem or even a painting, as we know. And so it's nice working with them, and I get all these principles or demands to take pictures of this and that, and they're very committed. So let's see if it happens in 2023.
Absolutely. Menna, it's been an absolute pleasure speaking to you today, and thank you so much. I would like you, we've spoken on this, you can read us out with your poem, Last Guilt.
Right, I'll finish with Last Guilt because it's the last, the latest poem I've written and translated by this wonderful translator called Emma Baines. And I read that the last eagle, golden eagle, had died in Wales, and then realised it had been shot, and it had been, pellets were discovered, but they tried to hide that by saying that it was a she eagle, had a disease, and so perhaps would have died anyway. But she had lived in the Cambrian Mountains for 12 years, and there were lots of hopes of getting a mate for her, and there are ideas to reintroduce eagles to Wales, which would be quite something. And so I wrote this poem remembering that eagles in early Welsh poetry has a special significance, and a special word in Welsh which is so potent is the word heno, tonight. And they repeat tonight so many times in early Welsh poetry. So I started it repeating that one word continuously in the poem. So this is Last Guilt. She won't see the wood tonight. The ground won't hear her cry tonight, but hungers for the flesh she craves tonight, our bold embodied yesterdays, our golden eagle, but tonight. In her spell on the air, on a wing, fierce rain, breath soared over clouds, crossing time, as in heaven, a 2-meter span to hold us apart, as we fall, as she fell, no defence in the crossing of old swords, her passage forged a spoil. From ore of the skies to 2 metal pellets, executed, airless, the last of her tribe. And instead of drinking the yield of her prey, her beak doused in sun rays where sky meets land, her X-rays were taken when walls meet corners and darkness conceals the smut from her down. 12 solitary years wore history on her back, but day on day did she ache for a mate to warm the living from life, draw threads, hatch flesh from the bones of exception. FOI decide I'll skip the bit about the shooting. From 4 walls of office, freedom of information clipped. No matter, man writes, she had a disease. But her legend circles the valley tonight, the quiver of flight. Her gilded light falls from the sky over mountains tonight, where Cambria gold mines its ore from a bird, gnawed neath eryr ar flaen derry o un I un, eithant oll.